Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So we are welcoming back to the podcast Mr. David Duhalde, who has, it's been a number of years since you've been graced us with your presence. You've been a busy boy. You've been out working. You've been undermining, our capitalist plutocracy, working to build people power, and you've in that context, as well as doing some organizing work, you've written a great review of a book about the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, an organization of which I've been a member for almost 10 years now. But, you've also been in the organizing trenches for a long time. And maybe just to kick us off, can you, give us a little bit of an update on maybe sort of the state of DSA and sort of lefty organizing, from your perspective, over the last couple of years?
Yeah. So I think last time we checked in, Joe Biden was still president. So big change there. And I would say, and we'll probably get into it in the book, that reflected not a nadir, certainly in our lifetimes of left-wing activism, but a real tension point, because you have to get in the situation where from the radicals to the progressives are like, what do you do when someone who's not a political figure everyone can hate is in power? And how do you do critical support? How do you deal with some of the progressive things he was trying to do, especially around the environment and stimulus and even labor, to the very not progressive things around, especially the foreign policy. And I feel that the return to Trump is not a coincidence why this is DSA is as big as it's ever been, which we'll get into, and I think why a lot of actually other left-wing groups, have seen a resurgence. But what I find fascinating is the Trump bump 2.0, which, to be when left-wing groups start getting funding, was not the same as it was the first time. I think that, one, there was a delayed effect. I don't think we saw the Resistance 2.0 kick off in the same way, but then it's really gotten recovered. So I think my union, I work for a public sector union, though I'm a rank and file member on doing a program where I participate. So one thing we've been doing is, resistance work, these No Kings rallies. And we were doing it partly just because it was the morally right thing to do, and also we want to engage the membership. And we were overwhelmed being in these marches with hundreds of thousands of people, and that the second one was so much bigger than the first one too. When we were who's good? So now we're gearing up for the third one, and I think that's an interesting thing where you see DSA and the resistance liberals are doing well, but some of the immigrant rights groups they've done okay, but I think that there's other groups like the kind of Our Revolutions and other kind of progressive Democratic groups aren't faring in the same way. They're not getting that buzz, and I think that reflects that I think we'll get into is that people really are polarized, and they're looking for either radically different solutions and candidates, not just someone who's going to be a liberal, and they're also much more into direct action. Not to have that doesn't have to be militant. It could just be I'm gonna go to these mass demonstrations now. I'm a resist, and I'm going to vote for Pete Buttigieg in the primary. I mean, there's that real segment of Democratic voter who is so fed up, and I think that's a general state where we have a really restive body who really aren't don't view electoral politics solely as the solution, and aren't just looking for nice liberals. Which is why I think on a microcosm in my state is why I think Chuck Schumer is so vulnerable, and I think anyone on this call would get 30% of the vote. I mean, not to me. It's just I think that people are just so fed up with how he's handled. And I don't think that would have been possible 5-6 years ago. Certainly not in the Obama era.
Yeah, I mean, this seems to be the big, difference between Resistance 1.0 and 2017 Resistance 2.0. The media narrative that basically institutional authority was attempting to push at the beginning of the second Trump administration is that, the resistance is totally clapped out. Everyone's given up, just abandon hope, all ye who enter here type shit. And in fact, if you look at the number of people who are showing up to rallies, protests, all that sort of thing, it's actually way more than happened in 2017.
I agree. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's just thinking one microcosm example, And also, like, and it's not perfect, but I think it's interesting for your listeners to think about. Like, my union participated with other unions in honoring Alex Preddy, the nurse who was murdered by ICE. And we went to a VA Veterans Administration Hospital. 2,000 people showed up. The next day, 5,000 people showed up in Napoli Square in downtown New York for like the general strike. So even like it's not totally analogous to people push back, but I think it's interesting that like organized labor could not deliver more people than just like Instagram messages. So it shows you also just how people are organized in different spaces too and are showing up in much larger quantities than I think we've been used to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think in addition to the fact that, institutional capital was on the side of the resistance to some degree in 2017, and it is not this time. I mean, the Washington Post is the best example of that, owned by Jeff Bezos. In both instances, in 2017, they changed their motto to "Democracy dies in darkness." And now the motto, tacitly appears to be, "We are going to kill democracy in darkness and bury its corpse on the golf course," just like Donald Trump's first wife. There's always so much to think about with Trump. There are so many horribly fucked up things that he's done every single day that he has ever existed. But what was I going to say? The other aspect of this that's different is that in 2017, the bulk, I think it's fair to say, the bulk of the resistance was behind the Democratic Party leadership. They were saying, okay, what we need to do is mobilize behind Nancy Pelosi, behind Chuck Schumer, and we need to like put them back into power. We need to elect Joe Biden. That is what that culminated in. They successfully elected Joe Biden, and he didn't put Trump in jail. And so now I think that I mean, you look at this in the polling, it's completely flipped. The Democratic Party, in a way that the rank and file voters are deeply, deeply dissatisfied with the leadership in a way that they were not. That they were not in 2017, that is to say. Can you speak to that and how it's sort of like, changed things on the ground as far as organizing and whatnot?
Yeah, and I think it gets to like what we'll talk about with the book with movement parties and how movement parties are organized. But I don't want to jump too ahead. But what it does, at least in my gut reaction, is it makes, and I do think people have been more narrow in their challenges, which I think is a progress. So by that I mean specifically, like think about Justice Democrats, like they're running like 14 races. We're not having the Justice Democrats brand new Congress of like, if Pepperidge Farm remembers when it was like, we're going to challenge everyone in Congress. But I remember that was like an actual thing, like people have matured. So it's narrowing that, but it's also that people are much more open to more radical changes. And I'm trying to, I'll get more specific in that it's impossible to imagine a world where Zohran Mamdani wins, but it hasn't happened recently, where like where these institutional figures like Andrew Cuomo aren't just dog walking the opposition. And I think like he's an interesting example, but it's not the only example that we're seeing across the country where people are just like, with Democratic primary voters, I think is the way we can measure it most concretely, aren't open up. But there's still limitations. Like what's interesting too is like you see in like Minnesota before the uprising against and the general strike, the DSA candidate, Omar Fatah, he got the endorsement of like the Democratic activist for mayor, and he can't win in a nonpartisan election system. But it also, his endorsement alone showed, I think, there was a rested body, and that you're just seeing over and over again, like challenges. And like, we can even, let's move DSA, like the fact that like Brad Lander, or comptroller, is running a real challenge to Dan Goldman, an incumbent, over Gaza, but over other things, because Dan Goldman just is more centrist than the district is. Most people, I think, would have just left that alone and let Dan Goldman have that seat for life. And I just think that the Democratic voters aren't interested, and it's forcing people like Goldman to be more resistance lib, which is good. And I do think that's the ways we're seeing it. But overall, too, I think that and I'll just say, because I know Ryan, you and I have talked about this outside of the show, but it's like, the failure for the attorney general under Biden to do anything, I think is just not, people just don't forgive that anymore. And I just don't see a Democratic primary base that's going to allow kind of like just resting on norms anymore. And I do think that and I'm curious what Alexei thinks too, like, is this like, I do think there's more of a tit for tat and partisan, for better or for worse, where people are just like, this is our guy, and now it's our turn, and people are much more willing to fight dirty. So that's how I'm seeing it.
It's interesting. I think across the spectrum of dissatisfied voters, from people who know a lot about politics to people that are just barely involved. I think since Biden, the amount of just resentment towards the feckless cowardice of establishment politicians generally, and then specifically the inability of Democrats to be a opposition party, and including the Harris campaign, which, if we remember, because it feels like a million years ago, if we remember, even lefties were like, look, the Democrats got rid of Biden, who was, Genocide Joe, and who was also senile, and did something. Like, a lot of leftists anyway were like okay with Harris, and were willing to like see where that was going to go, because it wasn't Genocide Joe, and it looked like the party was finally doing something to mobilize. And then Walz seemed like a promising pick instead of Shapiro. And there was actually some energy from the left for those who care about electoral politics, at least. And then the actual campaign shifted to the consultant class, and she stopped talking about prices and economics and started campaigning with, Liz Cheney, and moving to the right on immigration, and giving a speech at the convention about having the most lethal armed forces in the world, right? And just totally deflated, especially with her inability on Gaza to really let anyone speak at the convention, et cetera, et cetera. There was a deflated kind of energy at that point, and then the loss really kind of compounded that, it seems to me. So I think like the rise of a Mamdani and the embrace of principled lefties, I think, has to be seen in the context of like so many repeated failures to just do the bare minimum to stand up for anything, let alone be ideologically left, right? So I don't know. I think that there's been some charismatic, talented politicians like Mamdani, but also just like a popular front of people who are just in favor of anyone with guts that has principle and integrity, willing to step up and do anything that looks like vision or opposition. I don't know what you think about that, but it just seems like people are just thirsty for that, and that helps, of course, mobilize people to act when it comes to these rallies or protests or various other direct action activities, right?
Yeah, and I think, just to put a bow on it, is like, this is like never a fight to get on with the online left, but I do concretely think that the majority of center left people are with me, and I think I assume with you guys on this, is like with the January 6th, like the fact there was like not only no justice for January 6th, but there was like the people who did get justice were released from jail. And it's just like, and it was just the idea that we gave returning to norms a chance, and that like basically from a public policy standpoint, it failed. Like, I mean, they just overturned everything legally, and people are like, no, we need to have people who go harder, who are like willing to defend this. And that's why it's been, when I was saying like third way, like New York Times trying to pump up the third way centrist movement again, I was just commenting on a friend's post. I was like, imagine if New York Times gave us as much coverage, who are actually winning and taking us seriously, and not just writing dismissive profiles on like these weirdos. Like, it's just like the amount of exaggerated space those organizations get, who are just being totally rejected by the voting base. And for good reason, because they're actually they're not stopping what they're supposed to be stopping, even if they're not passing. And I think it's a genuine vibe shift, the kids would say.
Yeah, vibe shift. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Zohran, and you're in New York, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and I think this maybe is the point to like bring this up, because like we are looking now at the mayoralty of Comrade Zohran, who has implemented Sharia socialism in New York City. That they're now, that the people are being paid $30 an hour to shovel blizzard snow off the sidewalk. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that Zohran probably is the most successful, like the most powerful socialist now in American history, like having reached the highest plane of power. Like Bernie, I think, was a previous high watermark, having almost won a presidential nomination, and that gave him a lot of power, a lot of influence in the negotiations over like the presidential platform in 2020. Like a lot of stuff that that Biden did, I think doesn't happen if Bernie did not do so well in the primary. If he was not like inches from victory, frankly, for a few glorious weeks in January 2020. But you know, like who else, you know, even is there? I mean, New York City mayoralty, we're talking about one of the most important executive offices in the country, if not
the New York mayor is a national figure in the way no other mayor is. I mean, just to support what you're saying.
I think he's like plus 48 favorability, you know?
Yeah.
Like insane and I don't, popular.
Yeah, and I can't think of another. I actually did something. I did a comparative history of the old Debsian Socialist Party and the new DSA for Russell Stiftung. So I read up a lot about the old socialists, and there was no one who came close to like that, even like say comparably like having that many people they governed, like except maybe the Milwaukee people, socialist mayors, because Milwaukee used to be more of a major city in the U.S., but it's really hard to think of a historic comparison. And certainly today, I mean, yes, Bernie's a senator, but he's one of 100 senators. He's important. He has I think Bernie's stature is more moral at this point than actually legislative, in the way that Zohran is an executive, has to make a lot of decisions, has to negotiate with the president in a much different way than a senator would.
He's running shit, you know, like he's in charge of a gigantic machine. I mean, the budget of the New York City government is like $100 billion. That's like as big as Florida. The Florida state government and the New York City government are of comparable size. It's within the same ballpark. And so, you know, can you speak to that in this review, you know, that you're talking about the book? We should mention it real quick.
Organize or Burn: How New York Socialists Fight for Climate Survival by Fabian Holt.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, you know, so like we're talking, you know, the sort of like second wave, like of post Bernie socialism, you know, reaching a new high watermark, I think it's fair to say, that is unprecedented in American history. And, you know, how do you think that happened? You know, what laid the groundwork for Zohran, and how did he like manage to, I think, again, important to emphasize, not only did he win, he came from nothing. He came from like 0% in the polls, literally in the space of a few months as an assembly member of one of 150 assembly members, and all the way to beat Andrew fucking Cuomo, the guy who was such, you know, a titan of New York City politics that he got people who hated his fucking guts to donate to him just because they assumed he was going to win, you know, and he beat that guy, you know, the Nepo baby of Nepo babies. So what is the story there?
So the story, and I think what Fabian Holt does a great job of, is saying that there's no one singular cause, but if there was a singular cause, if we're going to be cheeky about it, it's like the resistance to neoliberalism. And that might sound overly educated and, you know, obnoxious, but really what we're going to get in this conversation is like politics has changed because of the failure of mainstream parties to deal with the Great Recession. I'm talking about globally, that they implemented austerity, and there's been responses that have both created fascistic responses like MAGA, the Tea Party, and social democratic and democratic social responses, which we kind of see in the Bernie movement, AOC on, if we're going to reify them to people, and then Democratic Socialist America, I think is the most successful kind of organization there. And I was thinking about, when I was rereading my review of the book, which I do recommend everyone get the book, who was interested in DSA, or even just because it's really helpful. It helped me understand what I'm going to go into. If I could make one edit, I would have said like DSA is breaking 100,000 for the first time. Like I mentioned that again, and actually, like I forgot that was incredible detail where DSA, we had tried to break 100,000 when we got to 90. We did a big push, couldn't get there. Membership drops to like in the 50s actually, because during Biden, because it's just not as a restive body, and then we zoom back up. So how do you get there? And I think it's a couple of things. So one, it's like what we've already discussed, so I won't reiterate it. It's like people are looking for alternatives, political alternatives. And I think what we've seen in these is that voters who are progressive, who are also very well organized, like the resist libs themselves, do not see them in the Democratic Party leadership anymore. And so you have this one, people are looking for bolder ideas and bolder action. And so what Fabian Holt talks about in these movement parties, that movement parties don't have to be actually legal parties, which is a very helpful concept for me. So that's why I took time, and he took time too, to explain like the Tea Party. Tea Party was actually like a conglomeration of different 50C3s, 50C4s, like some probably more honest than others in how they were being funded and spending their money. But they did represent like a tidal wave that was able to like sweep out kind of blue dogs, not even like, and that's one of the key things I don't want to get off on tangent, but like we used to have really much more diverse parties. And I think my friend Paul Handyman in his book Rogue Elephant, which I'd also recommend, gets into this, how he reminds us that we used to historically have two major parties, each had a liberal wing, each had a conservative. We don't really have that anymore. We actually achieved kind of what Michael Harrington wanted, who I mentioned, the DC founders, like kind of we had a realignment. It wasn't like realignment he exactly wanted, but we had that. So what you have is, you then flash forward to New York, is you have people who are worried about Trump, who then are given an alternative, kind of assume this guy's coming, Andrew Cuomo's coming back. He's like kind of same old, same old. And I think people were just hungry for something else. And I think that what was the big difference, though, was it wasn't, and that's why I think it's the easiest thing for people to do is be like, oh, it was just so cute, so our videos are on me that went viral. And like one of the things he did early on, which people almost forget, is like he interviewed like Trump AOC voters in this district with the overlaps. And like, why'd you do that? And he like just genuinely is getting to know them, and it's one of the first viral moments. But there was just a ton of organization. Like he was, and I remember someone say, kind of a New York political talking head saying this, and it was so funny. And it was also something that, like, I think I was one of the only people who remember. It says, like, don't underestimate Zohran. He's used to sell mixtapes. Like, he was like, he knows how to hustle. And like, and by that I mean is also like DSA is selling the mixtape of the equivalent, which is canvassing. The DSA was just like canvassing for him before anyone was canvassing for any candidate. People are still like doing fundraising. The DSA is just like out there. And if that is the well-oiled machine, that none of this happens without like a decade now, 10 years, and the book does a good job of going through like also like the losses the DSA took in the beginning, running a candidate who then like came out, she was abused her kid, so she loses, and then but that candidate paved the way for Julia Salazar to win the district 2 years later, who's the state senator now, who, you know, is a really rising star. And there's, but ended up choosing not to run for Congress because she probably is on the trajectory to become like the Senate leader someday, within reason. And so these things happen because then Julia wins, and then there's a slate wins, then it expands. And then DSA becomes more of a well-oiled machine. And I think, well, I'll end on, because I want to make sure to get to more questions here from you guys too, is what's also happening, which I think the book does a great job, which gets forgotten, is political machines and Democratic clubs are also weakening. So DSA becomes like one of the few places that can really just turn out volunteers. So like labor and these machines just aren't turning out the volunteers because they key there for lots of reasons we don't have time to get into. But so you'll go to these events and you'll just see like DSA people or young progressive people or just resist libs doing all this work. And then you'll see like a couple of people in the union shirts, kind of like, which is actually, I would say, a sidebar, is actually a really problematic part for our theories of change. as organized labor being incredibly central, we really need to revive unions, because that's like they're not actually even delivering the stuff we don't want. But I think it's that. So then you have these culminations of this machines coming together, of DSA coming together, and with a lot of other progressive groups, not just DSA who wins that race, but the decline of also these key centrist and establishment roadblocks that are just like so weakened, and so you have this victory that happens because it's this perfect storm of like both change, but also any of these institutions that normally would have delivered a victory for the establishment just can't do that anymore. And that's why I remember like it's like, because ultimately the campaign contribution is an investment. And you just saw like the amount of money going down because people are like, why am I going to throw good money after bad to like spend against Iran? And so like shows you also people like eventually caught on. By the people, I mean the wealthy donors, that there was nothing they could do to stop what was going to happen.
We should mention too that NYC DSA is a big hub. I think the book says it's about 10% of the overall membership of DSA. Is it right? Is that right?
Yeah, and actually, I was thinking about that. Was that like now it's like 14%? And so it's the last time you and we spoke. I remember going over, like I said, like New York, there's always 10% Cincinnati, but I think because of New York's success, it's actually taken up a bigger and bigger share of the organization, which I think speaks to one, its ability to attract people then because success begets success. And also another important thing the book said, which I don't want to leave, is that a lot of what's actually reflects in this DSA's limitations right now is it's much more successful in urban areas, and it exists in rural areas, but the kind of politics we're talking about, this kind of, is more successful ultimately in high density urban areas that are blue, where you can like win primary elections and then become a hub because what DSA is really is a hub for other movements to like push its own candidates, to then do that movement agenda. But if you can't win those candidates, it becomes much harder. So it's just something that's worth also reflecting on, because I don't want this to be a rah-rah thing for DSA, and I think DSA is working on how to break into those communities. But it's a microcosm of the larger problems that the Democratic Party too is having in rural communities that it once had too. It's not unique to DSA. It's not unique. It's not just bad Democrats. It's a broader center-left problem of losing the heartland.
Yeah, the heartland.
Yeah,
I would say that the heartland of America is like Brooklyn. Hey,
that's where I am.
But I want to drill down into this. This question of parties a little bit more. I think it's very important to emphasize this because I think it illustrates a lot of how a traditional kind of, countercultural, lefty thinking and rhetoric about how to interact with the Democratic Party and the American political system is somewhat misguided, because you very often hear, oh, the Democrats are totally corrupt. We can't interact with these people. We need to form a third party. We need to run Ralph Nader in 2000. We need to run Ralph Nader again in 2008. And
again,
yeah, and I see where they're coming from, but if you drill down into the institutional details, you see why DSA is operating in the way that it is. Because the thing about the very bizarre, frankly, totally incomprehensible from a European context aspect of the American political system is that basically we don't have true political parties. The idea of a primary election where you have the who is going to be the candidate for the party is going to be decided by a state-run election rather than the internal dynamics of the party, which is a private organization. And that's how it works in every parliamentary democracy. You have your sort of your slate of candidates, and those people get set out. And here in the US, we're like, oh no, you have to have a primary election, and any random fuck can just throw their hat into the ring. And if they win the more votes for the people who are quote unquote Democratic Party members, which means they checked a box on a voter registration form, then they win. That's nuts. That's crazy talk. And the reality, what that means is that on the one hand, basically we have a two-party state. The Democrats and the Republicans are part of the government in the same way that in a one-party state like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the Ba'ath Party is part of the government. So we're sort of 50% of the way, and we're maybe approaching the 100% maybe soon under Trump of becoming, just like an authoritarian state. But on the other hand, if you think about that weird thing where anybody can choose to run in a primary, you can see that these parties, like they have an immense power in many ways, but they're also incredibly vulnerable in other ways. Like, it would be totally impossible for a European parliamentary party, for like the number 3 member of the leadership in a party to be knocked off by somebody like AOC in a primary election, which is what happened, because that's not how the dynamics play out. And so you mentioned the Tea Party, and the Tea Party, and, you know, going back years before that, the Republican conservative movement, or the conservative movement within the Republican Party, it was an entryist movement. They were trying to take over the Republican Party, and they did succeed in doing that. And, you know, I think that these sort of institutional dynamics, and the fact that AOC and Zohran and Julia Salazar and a number of others, member of DSA and DSA allies, have managed to win elections as Democrats, tends to suggest that the Tea Party method is the way to go. You do entryism into the basically rotten husk of the Democratic Party, which does not really have a serious, you know, presence in the mass of the people anymore. You know, I see people making fun of DSA. Oh, you only have 100,000 members. There's more Democrats in Staten Island than there are in the entire country. Well, like, what does it fucking mean to be a Democratic Party member?
Let's ask the people to pay dues to the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And that's actually what happened. I mean, my beloved Swedish Social Democrats, who, you know, as close to Moscow as I could get for like blind loyalty from a old young DSAer. I'll never forget when they did, their youth wing came over and they explained, like, when they stopped counting every union member as a Social Democrat, when they had to do that, I forget if it was legally or they changed that. Would you be surprised the amount of Social Democrats dropped in Sweden when you stopped like inflating the numbers? You know, because people actually don't want to, and especially Americans, I always say Americans care about freedom of association, but they also love freedom from association. And they don't want to pay for anything unless they have to.
Yeah.
It's just not.
But anyway,
yeah,
I did a
go ahead. Sorry, brother.
I was a little bit of a digression there, but, you know, to bring us back to talking about DSA and New York City and Zohran, can you talk about how DSA and New York City DSA, that chapter has sort of positioned itself as a quasi party that is sort of interacting with the Democratic Party, quote unquote, but not, you know, being you know, fully of it.
Yeah. And so what I would say, a couple of things, and I think it's important. What was really great about this book is the book takes, so what Fabian Holt does is he looks at one actually unsuccessful, quote unquote, state Senate campaign of David Alexis, but then that actually leads to a victory in New York State for a bill that David Alexis' opponent was the nominal sponsor of, but like didn't actually want to do anything of, and forced him to like pass this bill, public renewables. Well, what Fabian Holt does, which is going to get to Ryan's great question, is like he looks at it as like, how did this election, the single election, actually look at like national and global trends? And I think one thing Ryan was getting at before we get to New York DSA, which I think is really helpful, and I want to plug the American Prospect too of the show, is like he's talking about like you couldn't have it in Europe, and I agree. And what Fabian Holt goes over, and I talk about it in my review, is like, for example, these movement parties are created in Europe, but they are actually parties overall. They're actually like new parties like Podemos in Spain, Die Linke in Germany, that are like counter to the traditional Social Democratic Party. And what we see now, and I think Grant Morgan wrote a good piece that I read today in the American Prospect about the Labour Party collapsing, is that the Labour Party in Britain is also collapsing and lost this by-election, and it finished third in a seat it's traditionally held to two movement parties, basically the Greens from the left and Reform from the right. But why isn't it happening in the United States? Well, because as Ryan says, we don't have parties. And I left that on my review because I thought it was too snarky when I say, well, DSA technically isn't a party, it's a 501c3. But I also wanted to add, I chose to not say it, but you said it. Well, actually, the Democrats, Republicans aren't a party either. So it's all kind of moot who's a party and who's not in this case. It's actually how you're organized. So what DSA does, but DSA acts more like a traditional party, and that DSA by traditional party, I mean, we're really talking about like a European classical party and like having a membership, having a line, having things that are decided, picking the candidate itself, like to then present to the election, even though it's basically just primaries. But DSA, New York DSA at this point has like kind of almost internal primaries where like people, if they want the DSA endorsement, they go to a forum. Like Antonio Reynoso, who's the borough president. So we have these not totally symbolic positions, but these in New York for each borough called the borough president, and he's running for Congress against the DSA candidate Claire Valdez, who's an assembly member as well. But he went to the forum. I mean, but he went to the forum. I don't know if he's a paper member or not, but he went to the forum. Like he presents himself, and there are other more concrete examples, I think, where you have people who are like, I think Claire is a good example, where another DSA wanted to get the nomination. DSA picks its candidate. We can't legally stop people, as Ryan was noting, from running, but like eventually the organization kind of picks if people get the message, and they're pretty much, and there's an organizational culture that develops in which you are like not, you're going to just defer to the DSA's choice, and you're not going to run again. So you have this organization builds over time, and what Fabian noted too, which I think is really important, is that like DSA is like an electoral movement, but it's not just about elections. Whereas was talking about the Democratic clubs. The Democratic clubs exist to elect Democrats, to get those people in office, and then kind of like that's it. And like they don't exist to really, push a broader agenda, and they certainly don't act what I would say like DSA does is as a hub for other movements. And what makes DSA work, I want to emphasize again, is like you have these hubs for like, I'm in the labor working group. So the labor working group can then talk about prior legislative and movement priorities for working class people, for like unions, non-unionized workers, which is most still even in New York, most workers. And then those filter up to the candidates who then can advocate for that. And what this book highlights is the Build Public Renewables Act, where like the eco-socialist working group made this a priority. And like I mentioned with the Tea Party, we talk about the Tea Parties. The Tea Party also like engaged in disruptive action. The great example is like going to all those downtown halls. I was at one of them for Just Stop Obamacare, scaring the lights out of the elected officials and empowering the right-wing elected officials to be like, it didn't stop the passage of the Affordable Care Act, but certainly helped water it down. And I think that's what DSA is able to do. DSA is able to do this direct action. And so the book highlights like stop, like highlighting the donors and doing sit-ins for the bill, then running a candidate challenge the guy who's the ostensible sponsor. And then like once, even though he loses, then scaring that guy who's going to work. And they said like, it wasn't just electing people, it was all these things combined that create success. And I think that's like how DSA does it, is like creating an umbrella network where these different movements can actually coalesce and coordinate. It's not always easy, as someone I've been there, a lot of fights, right. But it's democracy. And it's actually what we would want in society to be. Is like, and that's where I think
it's doing the thing.
Right? Yeah, it's like what Jacob, and that's why I said this. The last thing I'll say is what I think Jacobin really liked my last line is like, we ultimately realize like it's better than stale leadership. It's like this changing turnover, as much as tough as it is better than just like the same people in power for 40 years, doing the same thing.
It's, as you say, it's a kind of microcosm of what democracy needs to be, which is messy and factional and bottom up and full of people that are passionate about different things and coalition building. And as you point out in your review, and as is in the book, DSA teaches people or requires people to do politics, and it creates leaders through that, because people that are doing democracy internally to work out how to bring together people from different working groups or different factions, how to figure out what the agenda is, or whether to endorse a candidate, or the groups who are more or less into electoral politics. All of that messiness requires like the kind of like virtue ethics, if you will, the skills informing the kind of relational excellences you need to end up being a great leader, whether it's someone who is going to help someone get elected, whether it's someone who's going to unionize, whether it's someone who's going to run for office themselves. And so I think in our contrast to what does it mean to be a Democrat and to say you're part of the Democratic Party, I check a box, maybe I keep checking it, maybe I don't. What does it mean to be really an active DSA member? Boy, that's a universe of difference there. And that is why it's so powerful to have, 10,000 of them or more in New York or 100,000 in the country, because that is kind of constitutive of a new vision of politics. And we can show people not just through the ideological or policy, visions that are given to people in door knocking or other kinds of campaigns, but in the skills that have been acquired through those kind of messy debates and through those processes, right? And that makes for talented politicians like Mamdani, I think. It makes for people who understand that principle has to be married with that relational politics, that messiness. So
Yes.
I don't know. It strikes me as important as a contrast to the Tea Party, even if the Tea Party has like the movement politics of the passion. I guess, they're a little confused with get your government hands off my Medicare, but otherwise that the ideological consistency of a kind of like low tax kind of thing that they were bringing to the right. I think that the passion, the direct action, and the ability to give a vision and manifest it and how you relate to people is, it couldn't be more different from the Democratic Party politics, right?
Yeah, just a quick thing on that is the Tea Party doesn't exist in the same way, and I feel it's been supplanted by MAGA. And the big difference
is Turning Point. What would you say? Turning Point USA is like a what's the kind of corollary? Is there a corollary?
I think like what I was just going to say is like what you're getting at, and I hadn't thought about till you said it, is like not that anyone coming into this conversation thought there was a moral equivalency of the Tea Party, but the Tea Party actually isn't democratic, and but it speaks to the anti-democratic authoritarian nation of the right, where they're like perfectly happy to have MAGA be. It's essentially a Trump movement. He's the guy, and we'll see what happens after him. Whereas DSA, as much as I think the media wants to make Zohran DSA, he's not. He's like, does he have an outsized influence? Yes. I think, for example, there was for those who don't know, Chiosei was my city councilor, wanted to challenge Hakeem Jeffries, and that was one of the few very close endorsement, and he came out against Chia doing that, and she barely lost that endorsement. So I think he probably lost because Zohran intervened. Does that mean DSA? But there were still 47% of the people voted against what Zohran wanted, and it's not. And so I think there's a really interesting thing where there's not, and in the interview actually gets to where it's like, DSA was very much Michael Harrington's organization. Like he was the chair, then the co-chair, but he was not, but like Barbara Ehrenreich was not really his peer in that way. There's even the co-chairs now, they're the elected leaders. I respect them a lot. I'm actually good friends with one of them. Happy birthday, Ashik. It's his birthday today. But
is it really?
It's not.
Yeah, I was in. Sorry, I just wanted to interrupt you to mention I was in a book club with Ashik for like 3 years.
He's another one of our DC Jacket and Era.
Yeah, we read through Capital and like a dozen other books. It was great. Yeah. Lovely fellow.
Fellow. Now he's the co-chair of DSA, and he's great. I'm sure he's a friend, but it's not. He is not. But even he would be, because he's Democratic elected. It's not his organization. It's not his co-chair Megan Romer's organization. It's very much a collective organization. That's not even corny to say. It's just true. And I think that's like a really powerful and ideological difference between like socialists and the Tea Party. Who's actually committed to democracy.
Yeah, it's so much bigger than it was. Like Michael Harrington, we all know him. Yes. We all love him. He wrote some great books. One of them's called Socialism, I think.
Just called Socialism.
But like back in the day, DSA was a totally fringe thing. They were not winning mayoralties. It was like under 10,000 membership thing. It was mostly academics and elderly hippies and stuff. Now we're talking about serious power. We're talking about people with, like tens into the now hundreds of thousands of paying members. Paying, that matters a lot in this country. And they're winning the goddamn, mayoralty of the biggest and most powerful city in the world, honestly. And
which is why David wrote about the comparison to Eugene Debs and the Socialist Party, right? Yeah. Like the height, I think 1912 was 120,000 members, although today that would be like 500,000.
Yeah.
But still, you thought that was the more apt comparison in terms of political power and for others.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting, if you take a step back, you're like, and compare that period now, one is they actually faced a lot of similar problems. People would join and they'd forget and they'd lapse out. I think the major difference then, besides everything with the technology stuff, is what we were just talking about a few minutes ago with like the liberal and conservative wings of the Democrats and Republicans. It was much more valid then, and what was the fascinating thing for me to visit for the first time, even though I, like probably many countless numbers of undergrads, heard about Warner Sombart's "Why No Socialism in the U.S." You're basically taught like, oh, it's because workers have like such a good opportunities in the U.S. They love roast beef and apple pie, his favorite line, and that's why they're not socialist. And it's actually he's a much more sophisticated, though. In Irving Howe has critiqued it well, but to get to the point of like and he talks, but he says, he's like, the difference between Democrats and Republicans is like nothing, in the sense that he was saying back then they were like kind of they had their liberal and Republican wings that kind of like depended on the region, like. They were very incoherent. They were not like the parties he was used to in Germany that were much more ideological. He's like, so the socialists were offering like at least something coherent that was different. And we don't have that now. And that's one of the things I push in DSA, which is my unpopular take, is like, where DSA, like what we've kind of avoided talking about is a DSA strategy is working, but there's this whole push in DSA to be like, no, we're going to become a new political party. My take is like, that's never going to happen absent some constitutional crisis, because what we're doing is actually working. and I think, and who wants to make the first jump, and that it wasn't, and that you don't see that. And like when the socialists kind of like wouldn't give up on that, and then they tried to, by 1924 with the Progressive Party of La Follette, the actual socialists did support that. That didn't work out. And then they were in the wilderness, really, till now. I mean, the Socialist Party never recovered after La Follette. The Norman Thomas, it grew again under Norman Thomas, and he did do well by socialist standard, got 2% of the vote or something. But it never was like at the heights we're talking about. Like the really winning offices is now in the Debsian era. Like we're really seeing like network. It's even in the 30s, like with like when we could still have Milwaukee's mayoralties. It was still so decimated. And there's also no Communist Party equivalent, which I think is interesting, which is also why we have like the foreign policy takes I think some of us don't love that DSA has, because like it's actually kind of like a coalition of socialists. It's not like a traditional social democratic socialist party in that way, or organization. So it's not saying it's complicated, but I think it is an interesting comparison to look at like what is the best apples to apples? And I do think the closest apples to apples is Debs and today, for a variety of reasons, including the factionalism, which can drive us crazy.
Factionalism, the DSA International Committee has given me some heartburn over the years.
I'm a former member of the IC, so I know. But I can imagine. I know you've had disagreements, and it's a democratic organization. You're allowed to have disagreements.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, and this, that kind of illustrates, the how DSA is much more vibrant and alive than the quote unquote Democratic Party. Which is more or less just like a piece of paper that appears on people's, in people's mailboxes during election time for almost every person in the country. We're talking about an actual institution that matters, that people actually participate in.
You can't get real debates within the Democratic Party, right? You can't, unless it's coming from, lefties who are pushing and pressing the centrists and neoliberals. The DSA factions have different political philosophies. They have different strategic ways of thinking in terms of how to make change happen. In the Democratic Party, it's just like, can you defeat the consultant class, or is a given politician right? You know what I mean? Like are the donors and the political consultants going to win out in terms of what a politician does on the campaign trail or in office or not?
There's not even
Texas primary is a great example of that. Texas primary right now. I mean, I have my preferred candidate. Doesn't really matter. Not Texas. I don't vote there. But it's really coming down to a lot of identity politics and how they present themselves. I don't really see the same substantive debates in the Texas Senate primary right now that I would see in like a TSA discussion about like who we support. I mean, I just don't. Maybe that's condescending, but I just don't see it, and I don't think the candidates are leading that way. I don't think, and more importantly, in a certain way, as candidates, the surrogates aren't leading that way. But the surrogates are very much kind of filling into those narratives.
I mean, again, to return to the point about like parties not having any sort of internal democracy, where like any random fuck can run for whatever seat if they can win the primary election. DSA has an internal democratic socialist culture, where like there are actual mechanisms of accountability. There are ways by which the membership can have their voices heard. And I think that it's just absolutely central to how it has managed to punch way, way, way above its weight in the national context. An organization that has like less membership than I believe the car dealership association won the goddamn New York City mayoral race. It's shocking. And yet it's also, it speaks to how big of a void there is in American politics for something that can organize and coordinate in this fashion. Like if you can get your shit together, and even we were just talking about before we started recording our friend David Duhalde and his famous article about Slack, that the most important
basic
reality
facts about politics.
Politics about Slack. Almost nobody's paying attention. If you can mobilize like a decent 1%, 2%, 3%, 5% of the population behind something, you can get it done a lot of the time. And that's just, I think, how DSA has been organized and how it's been, implementing its program. It shows you that actually can work.
And it's just one thing I want to add, which I hadn't thought about. I don't think my the book review addresses too much, but I'm actually wearing like a Joel Brooks Senate for City Council. He's won a Jersey City Council seat. DSA guy, friend of mine. He and Jake Efros won seat. What was fascinating when you're talking about too is like DSA is one of the few organizations, probably besides the labor union in a certain way, where like volunteers from out of state will come, and like all these New Yorkers come. And part of it also is because of the democratic high standards, you can actually, and this is funny, if you think about it almost from an economics standpoint of like symmetries of information and like what people can trust, like you're like, oh, the chapter endorsed that person, they must be good because the process to be endorsed is so rigorous. You're like, you just automatically trust. You're like, well, if they were endorsed, they must be fine because you just, and it also like, and so you just get these volunteers who come without question because they're like, they can trust that this candidate's going to be fine. Where you don't have that in a lot of political organizations where you not necessarily trust. I'm going to try to be polite and not say that about name other organizations, but I do think also the post first wave of Trump organizations that sprung up who didn't embrace democracy, who didn't allow a democratic filter, like they're the ones who are weaker, except for Justice Democrats who took a very vanguardist model to their credit, which is like, we just elect people. We're not like a membership organization. That's different. They were honest. They said, we're not a membership organization. They ended up moving away from that. And we're just going to focus on getting people elected. They still exist and doing okay. And DSA, who's very democratic, and everyone else is kind of like, maybe they're posting some endorsements, but certainly they're not. No one's writing books about, what they've achieved. And that's a reflection, I think, of like two roads.
The point of a party is supposed to create trust, so that you can be like,
trust.
It's a Labor Party guy. It's a Socialist Party guy. And so if they have the blessing of the party, I know that they are going to work for me. And so I, without having to go and like navigate some internecine disputes on Twitter or Blue Sky, I can just say, no, I'll sign up. I'll do some canvassing for you. I'll give you $50. And it all works out, and because there's internal democratic accountability, you can like these processes
what's amazing about the failure of the Democratic Party is like, it's almost the exact opposite. I trust that like establishment Dem is going to be corrupt and totally, just bought by the donor class. And like, I trust that completely. And also like people would have been okay with that because of how terrible MAGA and Trump is, had there been some trust in their ability, despite all that, to still be an opposition party. But that is giving such a huge opportunity, I think, to DSA and the left to kind of infiltrate and be the leaders we need in this moment.
You need a party, and a party that is willing to see where the cynical sort of like balance of power ought to lie, and when it makes sense to persecute your political opponents and when it does not. And, sometimes you could say, okay, well, they lost the election, and so we're going to let them rest on their laurels. And sometimes you could say, well, they lost the election and they tried to overthrow the government by force. And we will not be sort of trying to sweep that under the rug. They're going to come out from under the rug and they're going to try to roll the rug up and strangle us with it. So, steps must be taken. But at any rate, in our last few minutes, so we've not gotten to this part of it yet. So the eco-socialism piece of the book and and your article, can you speak to what that is about? How has DSA gotten involved in public power and the green transition away from fossil fuels?
So as I mentioned in the book, what has been a big change is DSA embracing eco-socialism at all, and that it didn't actually happen right away. So I think a logical assumption would be, as our conversation is, okay, DSA has its Transform convention in 2017. It leaves the Social International and it endorses boycott, divestment, sanction of Israel. It must have done everything. But actually, it didn't do anything about eco-socialism. And I remember people complaining. They're like, what? It was just like not a priority. And it was kind of reflected what I noted, like that democratic socialists always cared about the environment, but it just was not the top issue. And I think that is partly because climate change has become more acutely part of a present. And that's what Fabian Holt talks about in his book, that it's, especially for Zoomers, it's much more like for them, obviously, it's much more the existential question than like labor is for me. So DSA, and that we at DSA, believe that the only solution to the climate crisis is a more democratic socialist world that we can mitigate these. So DSA, so one way to do that is to figure out ways and legislation that are really increasing the role of the state and counteracting corporate power. And so that was the bill Public Renewables was a bill that ended up becoming part of the budget and passing, which was to give already existing authorities in New York State the power to do more investments and into green energy. And so, and how I was able to do that was some of the things I mentioned, but also was just having people with bigger platforms like Jamal Bowman, who was then a congressman at the time, was really into the Green New Deal for schools, allowing them to increase the presence of this. And as I think Fabian Holt says, and we kind of echoes our thing is DPRA could not have been passed if it was just a quote unquote Democratic Party. It had to be a movement led effort that was being channeled through a quote unquote party, but that was DSA, to really push against these institutional roadblocks, which is like an institutional roadblock they identify too, is that like the lead sponsor actually didn't want to pass, but that no one was going to push him because of all these democratic, quote unquote, democratic norms for like, well, it's the lead sponsor who wants the bill, so we have to like defer to him. And these are like what the DSA assembly members and state senators are being told by their colleagues. They're like, well, if he doesn't want to pass it, that's like, and they're like, no. And so they ended up, so the organization scares him into like a primary challenge, and then he does it. And I think that's a great example of like what we've been talking about with the movement parties, but also like a real tangible thing for working people that now we can talk about. Like, it's not just like Medicare for all whom I love, but that's a long way away. It's like, here's something we're doing to actually make your life better. That is dealing with one of the biggest, if not the biggest crisis of our lifetimes right now. That's also going to be a make or break, because we're going to, and that's what's going to face with for Mayor Mamdani and any elected in office, because you actually have to deliver something. And not to go too off topic from your question too, but I think what I see as the biggest challenge now is like, how much do we want to be boosters? I'm actually in the like be booster camp, in that I understand like the trauma from Barack Obama, where we felt people were too soft on him and like we're not standing up to him. But there's a point also where we do have to defend our program when it's our people. And this is not just about one person; it's about everything. And I think like these victories make it easier, but we can't just be like socialists can't just be critical support for everything, including their own people, because there's going to be enough criticisms coming from not only the right but the center. So I think it's just something for the listeners to reflect on too. Is like, sometimes we got to get behind our people. And I think that I'm really happy that one of the big successes of DSA was eco-socialism kind of pushes against kind of like the stodginess from my generation that was not into it. And I really hope that's a promise for the future.
This is really, I know we're running out of time, but just to end on this question of the prudential wisdom of how to know, because I think you're right about the boosterism, but it's tricky, right? Let's put it this way. I think DSA is that sweet spot on the left, because you have leftists who don't believe in electoral politics at all, and they're just cynical. And if someone is elected, let alone elected as a Democrat, then that's just ipso facto proof that they're already sold out or whatever. That's just ridiculous. And then there are those who, don't understand the need to put feet to the fire and pressure even our own people. And this is kind of what you talked about before. It's bottom up. And that means that we're not just run by the celebrities at the top, that they're supposed to embody the will and energy of everyone. And it's a collective thing. And we pressure them and we call them out for when they make mistakes. But it's, I think part of what you're saying about maybe Mamdani, this is early. He's just begun to have like sometimes uncharitable or vicious or just speculative attacks on his intentions or on strategy. That's self-defeating. And there's this kind of like tendency to be too quick, to be kind of leftier than thou, be too quick to criticize. When you don't know kind of the different calculations of an executive position and what kind of negotiations are going on behind the scene and what the strategy is. How would you advise people who are leftists, who are maybe part of DSA or who are just listening and trying to think about this problem, to understand how to not give away their critical thinking skills or give away the important, pressuring politicians and pushing them, no matter who they are, to do the right thing on the one hand, but not to give in too easily to kind of like calling out traitors, or like what kind of criticism is a mistake as a form of criticism, or like how should people think through that prudential balance, would you say?
Yeah, I'm very curious what you guys think too, because I think it's a very tough question that we're all going through, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, but I would argue that people need to boost, so you need to also praise publicly as much as, especially for our people, as much as you criticize, if not like more praises. So I don't think there's any criticisms are off the table, but if your ratio is like, I'm only chiming in to say like they did this wrong, they did that wrong, it's actually strategically an error too, because elected officials need to know like what you actually like they're doing to like also reinforce it. And I remember calling an elected official, I rarely do this, but I remember like there was an elected official who said something really good when this other conservative office holder said something horrible about, like, he was like using those like Pinochet helicopter memes. It was like, oh, and the person was like, that's awful. And I called their office. I just said, thank you for doing that. I'm son of a Chilean. Like because they do need to hear that that's like actually important, and that it's like something that their constituents and our voters care about. And I think that's why I think the balance is like making sure we defend it, because the audience, what I think, and I was talking about this in my union for something else, but people forget the audience isn't just the elected official. The audience is like the voter, your neighbor, who if trust me, they're getting a lot of negative stuff about our agenda. I have this flyer I saved that was because I live in a very African American neighborhood, so it was a blanket like the target was African Americans, but it was about DSA. Like there's already enough propaganda out there. So we have to also view our role as like saying our agenda is great and these people are doing the best they can. They're not perfect humans, but I think that's that. If everything is just criticism, then what's the point? Because there's already going to be enough criticisms coming out there from the right and the center, which I think is key. So that's my take. It's just try to do a little more positive without giving up your critical thing.
Yeah. Well,
what do you think, Ryan?
It's just that easy. You just follow Dave's advice, and you too can become mayor of New York City. I
guess just know your audience too. It's one thing to talk, with fellow lefties privately and really get into the weeds on strategy or something. It's another thing to think about on a podcast or wherever else you're speaking in a way that could influence the general understanding of socialism or socialist candidates or office holders. And we want to try to help boost the socialist people and their good deeds as much as possible as a general project going forward, right? And that, as you say, there's a lot of negative stuff to fight against already. So see if you can make the constructive criticism actually operate in a way that could actually change strategy for the better. That's one thing, but when it comes to influencing general understanding and like supporting the integrity of speaking to the integrity of earnest politicians like Mamdani, let's be on the right side of that.
No, I mean this is the problem with egalitarian politics that is never going to be conclusively solved, is the fact that like you have to deliver power to some kind of leadership structure, either an individual or a committee or something, and then that leader or committee or something is supposed to behave on to take actions to benefit the community and not themselves. And once they're in that position, there's a temptation to not do that, to do like Stalin did and just, set up to take advantage of everybody. And, it's always a balance, because on the one hand you say, okay, there's Stalin on the one side, we don't want Stalin. And on the other side, you could just say, well, anytime anybody gets any sort of power or influence or wins at anything, let's just tear them down so that we can demonstrate our greater bona fides. And it's never there's no right answer to that question. And it's a question of prudential wisdom and, political judgment and so on. And, we have to be. Well,
here's what I know about Mamdani anyway, and this is my last point. We might know that there are critiques of did he make his or betray the promise about the library funding, or was the budget negotiation done in this or that way? My students don't know anything about that, but what they do know is they heard about the $30 an hour to shovel snow, and they were going to drive from Philly to New York to be a part of that until they learned that you had to be a New Yorker. And these are, you know what I mean? So what we know is an amazingly smart and popular policy like that is reaching even an average undergrad student, and that's what we need.
Yeah, and it may be the case that whether you have sort of Zohran AOC, if we take them as a sort of idealized socialist politician, or Eugene Debs, versus Stalin, the absolute worst possible quote unquote socialist politician on the other hand, what you end up with could depend on the interaction with their constituency, to like the combination of loyalty, trust versus, honest criticism when they mess up. And I think that's something that if you're dedicated to egalitarian politics, it's inescapable. It's just going to be a pain in the ass forever because you can't. I come back to this quote from the British socialist Tony Benn. He said, something like, "There's no such thing as a train called justice. And if you catch, or there's no such thing as a destination called justice. And if you catch a train driven by the right man, you'll get there. Every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again." We can't assume that Zohran is a saint or AOC is a saint. I think that they're, as far as politicians that have been thrown up by the American political system over the last 30 years, they're in the top 1%, but you never know. People can change. People can get weird. We live in Pennsylvania. John Fetterman, a politician I supported, is the senator.
Famously not a DSA guy though.
So.
No, he wasn't. But
and I do think that one thing which gets at your question too, and this shows our change over the past 12 years, is people understand it goes from the resist live to the young democratic socialists starting chapters. They get organizations need to exist alongside these elected officials.
Yeah.
And the key difference there, which I think gets the boosterism, is and it's not just the organization exists, but everyone plays their different role. So I think that this DSA, there's also Our Time, which is his equivalent of Our Revolution, Mamdani's equivalent. They're doing it's he has something to engage his volunteers still, but it's not just all right, I got this, trust me. It's no, come to a rally. I want to not be at the rally, which he wasn't at the Tax the Rich rally, but he's well, you should still go. It's not, it's everyone plays a role, and and I think that's a big difference from Obama with Organized for America, which is kind of we're just going to put this in the DNC, Democratic National Committee, and then we're going to forget about it. Or even Bernie's Our Revolution, which is tried to be, I think, more than it could have been by being a membership organization that had no real democratic accountability. It's I think I think the left is learning, and I think that solves the boosterism too. If people have a real role to do, and they're okay, I want to focus on that, and it's not just a soap opera of what did my parasocial relationship do today that I can comment online.
Well, thank you for the good work you're doing, David. And it's always a pleasure talking to you about this stuff. So hope you come back before too long.
I hope so too. This was great. And you guys always get me thinking about stuff I hadn't even crossed my mind about the stuff I wrote myself.
Fantastic.
We will link to David's article as well as the book referenced, and also an essay that I've referenced many times recently about how political parties are illegal in America, that I think is incredibly instructive and bears on the whole discussion we've been having. But David Duhalde, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, guys.
And thanks for listening, everyone. We will see you in the next episode.